Before oil. Before borders. Before the name Venezuela was ever spoken, this land already had a story. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight, we'll travel slowly through the long and layered history of Venezuela. A land shaped by rivers and mountains, by ancient peoples and distant empires, by revolutions, oil wealth, hardship, and enduring hope. This is not a story of dates alone, but of quiet lives lived beneath changing skies, of generations who endured, adapted, and dreamed of something better. From the first indigenous communities who knew the land before borders, to the age of conquest and independence, from the rise of oil and modern power, to the challenges and reflections of the present day. This is the story of a nation, so settle in, let the past unfold gently, and allow history to carry you, slowly and calmly, into rest. Before Venezuela had a name, before borders, flags, or maps, before history was written down, there was only land vast, patient, and alive. The northern edge of South America unfolded slowly into what we now call Venezuela, a place of extraordinary contrasts. Long coastlines touched the Caribbean Sea, where tides moved gently against mangrove roots and sandy beaches. Inland, wide plains stretched endlessly beneath the sun. The Llanos, where grasslands breathed with the seasons. Dense jungles thickened toward the south, sheltering rivers that moved like quiet veins through the earth. And to the west, the Andes rose steadily, cool and misted, shaping valleys where clouds rested low in the morning. This land was not empty. For thousands of years, it was home. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, indigenous peoples lived across these regions, shaped not by empires, but by rivers, weather, and time. They did not think of themselves as belonging to a single place called Venezuela. Instead, they belonged to forests, plains, mountains, and waters. Each community, deeply rooted in its environment. Along the coast and waterways lived Arawak-speaking peoples, skilled fishermen and traders. They built villages near rivers and lagoons, where canoes moved quietly through reeds and shallow waters. Fish, shellfish, and cultivated crops formed the foundation of their diet. Their lives followed natural rhythms, tides, moon cycles, planting seasons, patterns passed down through generations. Further inland, especially in the southern forests, lived Carib groups, known for their mobility and strength. They traveled widely, navigating rivers with ease and defending their territories fiercely. To outsiders, they would later be described as warriors. But within their own world, they were hunters, parents, storytellers, and guardians of ancestral land. In the western highlands, in what would one day become the Andes region, lived the Tomoto-Cuica people. They were among the most settled and agriculturally advanced societies in the region. Stone terraces climbed the mountainsides, carefully built to hold soil and water. Crops such as maize, potatoes, and beans grew in ordered fields. Homes were permanent, and villages were tightly organized. Here, life moved more slowly, guided by altitude and climate. Cool nights followed warm days. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires at dusk. Tools were shaped from stone and bone. Clothing was woven from plant fibers. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a place. These societies were not frozen in time. They traded with one another. Ideas moved along rivers and paths. Objects passed from hand to hand. Shells from the coast, feathers from the jungle, stones from the mountains. Knowledge flowed quietly across the land, without written records, carried instead by memory and voice. Spiritual life was deeply woven into daily existence. The land itself was alive with meaning. Mountains were not just stone, they were ancestors. Rivers were not simply water, they were living forces. Animals were teachers, messengers, and companions in survival. Ceremonies marked births, deaths, harvests, and changes of season. Shamans guided communities through illness, dreams, and transitions, using plants whose properties had been learned over centuries. There was no sharp line between the sacred and the ordinary. Life itself was sacred. Conflict existed, as it always does among human beings. Territories were defended. Old rivalries flared and faded. But war was not constant, nor was conquest absolute. Power shifted slowly, locally, and without permanent domination over the entire land. Importantly, there was no single civilization ruling this region. No central empire, no unified authority. Instead, Venezuela existed as a mosaic of cultures, diverse, independent, and deeply adapted to their time moved differently then. Days were measured by light and shadow, not clocks. Years were marked by floods, droughts, and harvests, not calendars. History was remembered through stories, songs, and rituals, living memory rather than written record. This way of life endured for centuries, but it would not endure forever. Unbeknownst to the people living along the coast, something was already approaching from beyond the horizon. Not a storm, but ships. Not a season, but an era. A force that would bring metal, disease, religion, and a new way of seeing the world. One that divided land, measured wealth, and claimed ownership over what had never belonged to any single ruler before. When the first European sails finally appeared against the Caribbean sky, they would not just mark a moment of contact, they would mark the beginning of a long transformation, one that would reshape the land, the people, and the future of Venezuela forever. But for now, in this first chapter of the story, the land remains quiet. The rivers continue to flow, the forests breathe, the mountains stand, and the people live as they always have, unaware that history, as the world would come to know it, is about to begin. Before lines were drawn on maps, before territories were claimed in ink and law, the land that would one day be called Venezuela existed without borders. There were no fixed edges separating one world from another, no fences, no flags, no capital cities declaring authority over distant regions. Instead, space was understood through movement, memory, and meaning. Arriba bend a mountain ridge, a familiar grove of trees. These were the markers that mattered. For the indigenous peoples of this land, identity was not tied to an abstract nation. It was rooted in place and relationship. A person belonged to a community, a language, a set of customs, and, above all, to the land that sustained them. Movement was natural and necessary. Along the coast, families traveled by canoe, following the rhythms of fish migrations and seasonal tides. Inland, paths connected villages across forests and plains, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. These were not roads built for speed or conquest, but quiet passages shaped by need and familiarity. Indigenous, the wide grasslands stretching across central Venezuela. Life followed the seasons closely. During the rainy months, water spread across the plains, transforming the land into a vast, shallow sea. Fish appeared where there had been dry ground. When the waters receded, the plains returned, fertile and open. Communities adapted fluidly. Temporary shelters were built and left behind without regret. The land was not owned. It was shared, used, and respected. Survival depended on understanding change rather than resisting it. In the forests of the south, rivers served as highways. Dense vegetation made overland travel slow, but waterways offered clear routes through the jungle. Canoes glided beneath thick canopies where light filtered down in shifting patterns. The forest provided everything: food, medicine, materials, but only to those who knew how to listen and observe. Knowledge was accumulated slowly. Children learned by watching. Elders taught through stories rather than commands. Skills were passed down, not through formal instruction, but through repetition and patience. How to shape a tool, when to plant, which plant healed and which harmed, where animals traveled, and when to leave them undisturbed. This knowledge did not belong to individuals. It belonged to the community. Leadership, too, was different from what would come later. There were no kings ruling vast territories. Authority rested with elders, respected hunters, skilled healers, or those known for wisdom and balance. Decisions were often made collectively, through discussion rather than decree. Power was limited by proximity. A leader's influence extended only as far as relationships allowed. There was no distant ruler imposing laws on people they had never met. This kept society small, flexible, and resilient, but also vulnerable to forces they could not foresee. Trade connected communities across regions. Salt from coastal areas traveled inland. Feathers, stones, and pigments moved between forests and mountains. These exchanges were not only economic, but cultural. Stories traveled with goods. Ideas spread quietly, without conquest or domination. Languages shifted gradually from region to region. There were no sharp linguistic borders, only transitions, one dialect blending into another over distance. Communication required effort and patience, but it was possible and often essential. Spiritual beliefs reflected this openness. The world was understood as interconnected rather than divided. Humans were not separate from animals, or from rebirths, or from the sky. Everything existed within a web of relationships. Harmony mattered more than control. Balance was more important than growth. Time, too, was understood differently. Without written calendars, history lived in memory. Important events were remembered through stories repeated across generations. The past was not distant or abstract. It lived in names, rituals, and places. A rock formation might carry the memory of an ancestor. A clearing in the forest might recall a great gathering or a moment of loss. This way of life had endured for centuries, adapting, shifting, and continuing. But it existed in delicate equilibrium. Without centralized power, there was little defense against large external forces. Without permanent fortifications or armies, communities relied on knowledge of terrain and early warning. This had been enough, until now. Far beyond the Caribbean Sea, in lands unknown to these people, another worldview had taken shape. One built on ownership, hierarchy, and expansion. One that measured land not by memory, but by climes. That believed the world could be divided, named, and ruled from afar. When these two worlds would finally meet, the contrast would be stark. The newcomers would bring iron tools and weapons, unfamiliar animals, written laws, and a belief in borders lines that separated one ruler's domain from another. They would see land not as a living presence, but as a resource to be controlled. For the indigenous societies of this region, the arrival of such a worldview would be deeply disorienting. Their world had no borders, but soon borders would be imposed upon it. Not gently, not gradually, but with sudden force. In the quiet of daily life, no one could yet imagine this transformation. Canoes still moved along rivers. Fires still burned at dusk. Stories were still told beneath the stars. But history, unseen and unstoppable, was already moving closer. The age of a borderless world was nearing its end, and the next chapter of Venezuela's story would begin not from within the land, but from the sea. In the long, slow sweep of millennia, the northern shores of South America had been touched only by winds, birds, and rivers that seemed older than memory. But in the final years of the 15th century, in a world far across the sea, a new kind of movement was taking place. A movement of wood and sail, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the thirst for distant lands. It was August of the year 1498, when a fleet of European ships first approached the coast that centuries later would be called Venezuela. These vessels were commanded by the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus, though he sailed under the banner of the Spanish monarchy, commissioned by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. This was Columbus's third voyage across the Atlantic, and unlike his earlier journeys, which had brought him to the islands of the Caribbean this time, he sighted something wholly different: the mainland of South America. The coast stretched out long and low before him, softly washed by the waters of what we now call the Gulf of Paria. Columbus and his crew saw forests that pressed close to the shoreline, rivers twisting inland like serpents beneath green canopies. They beheld, for the first time in their lives, a new continent, vast, alive, and unknowable. At first, Columbus believed he had reached an island, but as the fresh waters of a great river swept into the Gulf, he recognized something greater. This was land, immense land, unlike any he had seen before. In his reflections, Columbus called the region Tierra de Gracia, the land of grace, a phrase that would endure in part as a poetic memory of that moment, a testament to the awe it inspired. The lush delta of the Orinoco River, teeming with life, seemed to him like a place where the Garden of Eden might once have flourished. However, Columbus's encounter was not the moment that gave the land its name. That event came a year later, in 1499. When another Spanish expedition set out along the coast to explore further, this group was led by Alonso de Ojeda, a seasoned Spanish navigator. But it was the presence of the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci aboard the ships that would have the most lasting impact on the geography of names. As the expedition sailed along the northwestern shores of the continent, they entered a wide inlet connected to an enormous lake that lay inland from the ocean. On the water's edge, the crew saw something unusual. Villages built upon stilts, their homes rising above the water in delicate balance. These were not fortresses or cities of stone, but living communities adapted to a landscape dominated by tides and flooding. To Amerigo Vespucci, the sight evoked a distant memory. The ancient city of Venice in his native Italy, where buildings stood above the waters of the lagoon, connected by bridges and narrow canals. In his mind, the resemblance was striking and remarkable, so the explorers began to refer to the region as Venezuela, Little Venice, a name soon rendered in Spanish as Venezuela. This naming was neither simple nor inevitable. In some accounts of the time, members of the voyage recorded that they also encountered indigenous peoples who may have used a similar word of their own, recorded as by one chronicler, suggesting that the new name might also echo an indigenous name for the area. But the story that endured most widely in maps and official documents was that of the Venetian likeness, a visual comparison that linked a familiar European city to an unfamiliar and distant landscape. Thus, the name Venezuela, a small phrase almost whispered across the waters, was born from a moment of first contact, from the sight of wood and water, and from the impulse to describe the unknown in terms of the known. But the meaning of the name would grow far beyond that original image, coming to signify not just lakes and villages, but the entire nation that would rise upon this land centuries later. Yet the first Europeans did not stay long in that moment of wonder. Their early visits were fleeting, driven not by calm exploration, but by the restless momentum of empire. They saw not only strange beauty, but also opportunity. Opportunity for wealth, for expansion, and ultimately for domination. In the year that followed Columbus's sighting and the naming of Venezuela, Europeans began to return again and again to these coasts. They were drawn to the water not by enchantment alone, but by reports of pearls, gold dust, and other riches. Along the northeastern shores, particularly around islands such as Cabagua and Margarita, Spanish explorers harvested pearls from the sea, exploiting both the natural wealth and the indigenous people whose labor was forced into service. These early years of contact were marked by a growing pattern, one of fascination entwined with exploitation, curiosity paired with coercion. All the while, the people who lived here before the Arawak, Carib, and many other indigenous societies watched, engaged, resisted, and adapted in ways driven by their own long histories. They had known this land for generations, understood its rivers and winds, its swamps and hills, and had named it in their own voices and languages. But in the European imagination, it was now Venezuela, a name carried back across oceans, recorded on maps, and repeated in courts and capitas far away from these shores. To be called Little Venice was a moment of interpretation, a European interpretation. But it was also the first step in a much longer transformation, a transformation that would not be completed in a year, or a decade, or a century, but would unfold over centuries of belonging, resistance, settlement, conflict, and change. And so, as the late afternoon sun glinted on the estuaries of the Caribbean coast, and as the mastheads of Spanish ships drifted to our distant horizons, the land remained. The forests and rivers, the stilt villages, and inland communities, all continued in their rhythms, a world that would soon have many names, but only one true beginning. The first encounters along Venezuela's coast had been brief, cautious, and uncertain. Ships arrived, anchored, departed, and returned again. But as years passed, those visits began to change in character. Curiosity hardened into intent. Exploration gave way to occupation. The Spanish crown did not see the northern coast of South America as a distant curiosity for long. It saw land to be claimed, wealth to be extracted, and souls to be converted. What had begun as scattered voyages soon became a deliberate project of empire. Spanish settlements appeared gradually, often clinging to the coast or following rivers inland. These were not cities of grandeur at first, but fragile outposts, wooden structures surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. The land resisted easy control. Dense forests, swamps, and heat slowed progress. Inland regions remained largely beyond Spanish reach for decades, but even limited contact had profound consequences. The most devastating force did not arrive with swords or armor. It arrived silently, carried in breath and blood disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses crossed the ocean with Europeans, entering communities that had no immunity. Epidemics spread faster than armies ever could. Entire villages weakened in weeks. Elders, children, hunters, and healers fell ill. Knowledge passed down orally for generations disappeared with those who carried it. Social structures fractured. Rituals meant to heal or protect proved powerless against unseen pathogens. The population decline was catastrophic. In some regions, indigenous numbers fell by more than half within a few decades. In others, communities vanished entirely. The land did not empty overnight, but it grew quieter. Fewer voices, fewer fires at dusk, fewer canoes on the rivers. For the Spanish, this devastation was both tragedy and opportunity. Fewer people meant less resistance. Weakened societies were easier to dominate. Alongside disease came forced labor systems, imposed in the name of order and faith. One of the earliest was the encomienda, a system in which Spanish settlers were granted control over indigenous communities. In theory, the encomendero was responsible for protecting and Christianizing the people under his charge. In practice, it meant exploitation. Indigenous men were forced to work in pearl fisheries, fields, and construction. Women were pressed into domestic labor. Food was taken. Movement was restricted. Punishment was common. The land that had once been shared became divided into holdings, marked by Spanish authority. The pearl fisheries along the northeastern coast became among the earliest sites of extreme exploitation. Divers were forced to plunge repeatedly into deep waters, often without rest, risking injury and death. Pearls were shipped to Europe, fueling wealth far from the shores where they were taken. The Spanish also brought Catholic missionaries, who followed close behind soldiers and settlers. Churches rose near settlements. Indigenous beliefs were dismissed as superstition or heresy. Conversion was encouraged and often coerced. Baptism became both a religious act and a political tool, a marker of submission to colonial authority. Yet the process was not uniform. Some missionaries sought to protect indigenous people from the worst abuses, arguing for humane treatment. Others aligned closely with colonial power. The church became both a refuge and an instrument of control, offering shelter in some places and enforcing conformity in others. Resistance never disappeared. Some indigenous groups fled deeper inland, beyond easy reach. Others resisted through attacks on settlements, sabotage, or refusal to comply. The Cari peoples, in particular, gained a reputation among Spaniards as fierce and defiant. But resistance carried risks. Spanish retaliation was often brutal, intended to discourage further defiance. Slowly, the balance shifted. As indigenous populations declined, the Spanish turned increasingly to another source of labor: enslaved Africans. Beginning in the 16th century, Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic and sold in Venezuela's coastal regions. They were set to work on plantations, in mines, and in households. A new social order began to take shape, one rigidly structured by race and origin. At the top stood Spaniards born in Europe. Below them were Creoles, Spaniards born in the Americas. Beneath them came people of mixed ancestry, indigenous survivors, and enslaved Africans. Each group occupied a defined place, with different rights, restrictions, and expectations. This hierarchy was enforced through law, custom, and violence. Land ownership concentrated in Spanish hands. Indigenous territories were redefined or erased. African traditions were suppressed, yet endured quietly through music, belief, and memory. Venezuela became a society shaped by inequality, not by accident, but by design. Despite this, daily life continued. Markets formed. Crops were planted. Families adapted in whatever ways they could. Indigenous knowledge survived in fragments, in farming techniques, herbal medicine, and place names that endured beneath Spanish labels. Over time, towns emerged. Caracas, founded in 1567, grew slowly into a colonial center. Other settlements followed, connected by rough roads and coastal routes. Spanish authority extended unevenly, strong in some areas, weak in others. The land itself resisted full control. Mountains limited movement. Forests concealed those who fled. The llanos remained difficult to govern, their vast openness favoring mobility over settlement. For centuries, large parts of Venezuela remained only loosely held by colonial power. Still, the transformation was irreversible. The world without borders was gone. In its place stood a new order, one defined by ownership, hierarchy, and distant authority. Laws were written elsewhere, wealth flowed outward. Decisions were made in the name of a king across the ocean. And yet, beneath this imposed structure, something endured. Memories of freedom, traditions adapted rather than erased. A growing population of mixed ancestry, indigenous, African, European, formed new identities, neither entirely old nor fully imposed. These quiet undercurrents would matter later. For now, Venezuela entered a long colonial age, marked by suffering and survival, loss and adaptation, an age that would shape the land and its people for centuries to come. The conquest was not just a moment in time, it was a condition, one that would linger long after the first ships had vanished from the horizon. By the late 16th century, Spanish rule in Venezuela had settled into something resembling permanence. The age of first conquests had given way to an age of administration. What had once been a distant frontier of empire became a managed colonial society, uneven, imperfect, but enduring. Life under the Spanish crown was not defined by constant violence alone. It was shaped by routine, by rules, by habits, repeated day after day, across towns, farms, and villages. At the center of colonial authority stood the King of Spain, a figure unseen and far removed, ruling through representatives who governed in his name. Venezuela was not yet a unified colony but part of a larger administrative structure tied to Spain's American empire. Orders arrived slowly, carried by ship across the Atlantic, often months out of date by the time they were enforced. In daily life, power was felt most strongly at the local level. Spanish governors, magistrates, and military officers oversaw towns and districts. They collected taxes, enforced laws, and resolved disputes, often in ways that favored their own interests. Justice existed, but it was uneven. Those with land, lineage, or wealth stood on firmer ground than those without. Colonial society was rigidly layered. At the top were peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe. They held the highest offices and enjoyed direct favor from the crown. Beneath them were Creoles, Spaniards born in the Americas. Though often wealthy and influential, Creoles were barred from many of the most powerful positions simply because they had been born on American soil. Below them stood a broad and complex population. People of mixed ancestry, indigenous survivors, and enslaved Africans. Each group occupied a defined place in society, governed by laws that regulated marriage, labor, movement, and even clothing. Race was not merely a social distinction, it was a legal category. The economy of colonial Venezuela was modest compared to other Spanish colonies, rich in silver or gold. Instead, it relied primarily on agriculture, especially cacao, which became the region's most valuable export. Vast cacao plantations spread along the coast and river valleys, worked largely by enslaved Africans. Cacao beans traveled across the Atlantic, feeding Europe's growing appetite for chocolate. The profits enriched plantation owners and merchants, while the laborers who made it possible remained trapped in cycles of exploitation. Inland, smaller farms produced maize, cassava, tobacco, and cattle. The llanos became known for livestock, where herders moved across open plains, developing a way of life shaped by horseback travel, seasonal floods, and long distances. These llaneros would later play a decisive role in Venezuela's history. Cities remained relatively small. Caracas, the colonial capital, grew steadily but slowly. Its streets followed a grid pattern centered on a main plaza, where the church, government buildings, and homes of the elites stood. Life revolved around this central space. Markets by day, gatherings by evening, religious processions marking the calendar. Church bells structured time. The Catholic Church was deeply woven into colonial life. It regulated births, marriages, and deaths. It offered education, charity, and moral guidance. Religious festivals punctuated the year, blending European traditions with indigenous and African influences in ways that were often unofficial but widespread. For many, the church was both comfort and constraint. While priests preached obedience and faith, they also recorded events, preserved knowledge, and sometimes advocated for the vulnerable. Yet the church remained aligned with colonial authority, reinforcing social hierarchies and discouraging dissent. Education was limited. Formal schooling was reserved for the elite, often provided through religious institutions. Most people learned through apprenticeship, family tradition, and experience. Knowledge remained practical rather than theoretical. How to farm, herd, trade, cook, survive. Indigenous communities, where they endured, lived under strict supervision. Some were relocated into missions, where they were taught Spanish customs and religion. Others lived on the margins, preserving fragments of their traditions quietly, adapting to survive. Enslaved Africans endured the harshest conditions. They were denied freedom, family stability, and legal protection. Yet even within bondage, they forged communities. Music, rhythm, oral storytelling, and spiritual practices became tools of Over time, African culture deeply shaped Venezuelan identity in language, food, belief, and sound. Despite the rigid order, colonial society was not static. Trade, legal and illegal, connected Venezuela to the wider Caribbean. Smuggling flourished, especially with Dutch and British traders who exchanged goods outside Spanish control. These networks undermined official authority and gave colonists a taste of independence. Slowly, quietly, resentment grew. Creoles chafed at exclusion from power. Merchants resented restrictions on trade. Rural populations felt neglected by distant authorities. Even some priests questioned the justice of colonial exploitation. Yet open rebellion was rare. Spain's grip, though imperfect, was strong enough to suppress large-scale revolt. The memory of conquest and the reality of military punishment discouraged open resistance. Life continued. Generations were born knowing no other system. Colonial rule became normal, even as it remained unequal. People adapted, endured, and waited, often without realizing they were waiting. But beneath the surface of routine, something was changing. Ideas from Europe about rights, reason, and self-rule would eventually cross the ocean. Economic pressures would intensify. Inequality would harden into grievance. The colonial world, carefully structured and seemingly permanent, carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. For now, under the Spanish crown, Venezuela lived a life of order and imbalance, stable, constrained, and quietly restless. For much of the colonial era, Venezuela appeared quiet on the surface. Towns functioned. Crops were harvested. Trade moved through ports and along inland routes. The Spanish crown remained firmly in control. But beneath this appearance of order, unease slowly gathered. Discontent does not always arrive loudly. Often, it begins as a subtle shift, a feeling that something is unbalanced, that promises are unevenly kept, that effort and reward no longer align. In colonial Venezuela, these feelings took root gradually, spreading through different layers of society in different ways. For the Creole elite, frustration grew from exclusion. Many Creoles were wealthy landowners, merchants, and educated men. They owned plantations, controlled local commerce, and managed daily affairs in towns and countryside alike. Yet, despite their importance, they remained barred from the highest political and administrative offices. Those positions were reserved for Peninsularis officials sent from Spain, often unfamiliar with local conditions. This exclusion was more than symbolic. It limited Creole influence over taxation, trade policy, and governance. Decisions affecting Venezuela were often made by men who saw the colony as a temporary assignment rather than a homeland. Over time, Creoles began to question why birth across the ocean granted greater authority than lifelong commitment to the land. Among merchants and traders, resentment took an economic form. Spanish colonial policy strictly regulated commerce. Trade was meant to flow only through approved ports and approved Spanish intermediaries. Prices were controlled. Competition was restricted. These rules often harmed local producers and enriched monopolies based far away. Smuggling became a quiet act of resistance. Dutch, British, and French traders offered goods at better prices and paid more for local products. Along Venezuela's long and difficult-to-police coastline, illicit trade flourished. While officially condemned, it was often tolerated, even participated in by local authorities who benefited from it. Each act of smuggling weakened respect for imperial control. For indigenous communities, discontent was older and deeper. They had endured displacement, forced labor, cultural suppression, and population collapse. By the 18th century, many lived under constant supervision, confined to missions or marginal lands. Their grievances were rarely recorded in official documents, but they were real and persistent. Some resisted quietly by preserving language, rituals, and communal bonds. Others fled deeper into forests or plains. A few rose in open rebellion, though such uprisings were swiftly crushed. Among enslaved Africans, resistance took many forms. Some resisted by escaping, forming maroon communities in remote regions where Spanish control was weak. Others resisted through subtle acts, slowing work, preserving forbidden traditions, teaching children the memory of freedom. Rare revolts erupted from time to time, fueled by cruelty and desperation. These acts rarely threatened colonial rule as a whole, but they revealed its fragility. Discontent also arrived through ideas. By the late 18th century, the world beyond Venezuela was changing. Across the Atlantic, the Enlightenment challenged old assumptions about power, authority, and human rights. Philosophers wrote of reason, liberty, and equality, ideas that questioned absolute monarchy and divine rule. Books and pamphlets crossed oceans quietly, often banned but eagerly read. Educated Creoles discussed these ideas in private homes and informal gatherings. They debated the nature of authority, the meaning of citizenship, and the possibility of self-government. These conversations did not yet call for revolution, but they reshaped how people understood their place in the empire. Events elsewhere intensified this shift. The American Revolution demonstrated that colonies could break from European rule. The French Revolution showed that even kings could fall. Though Spain tried to block these ideas, they filtered in through sailors, merchants, and travelers. At the same time, Spain itself grew weaker. Wars in Europe drained the crown's resources. Administrative reforms attempted to tighten control and increase revenue from colonies. Taxes rose. Oversight intensified. These changes meant to strengthen imperial authority. Instead, sharpened resentment. Venezuela's economy felt the strain. Cacao prices fluctuated. Trade restrictions tightened. Local producers found themselves squeezed between imperial demands and global markets they could not freely access. For ordinary people, farmers, laborers, artisans, life grew harder. Food shortages occurred. Debt increased. Inequality became more visible. While the elite debated ideas of liberty, the poor experienced discontent as hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Yet unity remained elusive. Colonial society was deeply divided. Creoles, indigenous peoples, Africans, and mixed-race populations did not share the same grievances or visions for the future. Trust was limited. Fear of upheaval restrained bold action. Many still believed reform within the empire was possible. They hoped for fairer laws, greater local autonomy, and recognition of Creole authority, not full independence. The idea of breaking entirely from Spain felt dangerous, even unthinkable, and so discontent simmered rather than exploded. It lived in conversations held behind closed doors, in letters written cautiously, in prayers spoken with doubt, in a growing sense that the old order no longer fit the world as it was becoming. The colonial system, once accepted as inevitable, now seemed fragile. Few could predict exactly when or how change would come, but many sensed that it was coming. History, once slow and distant, was beginning to stir. And when the moment arrived, the seeds planted during these quiet years of dissatisfaction would finally break through the surface, reach Venezuela in ways no one could fully foresee. History rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it arrives quietly, through uncertainty, hesitation, and moments when ordinary routines no longer feel secure. In Venezuela, the year 1810 began not with open rebellion, but with confusion spreading slowly across the Atlantic world. Spain, the distant authority that had governed Venezuela for 3 centuries, was in crisis. In Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, was forced from the throne, imprisoned, and replaced by Napoleon's brother. The legitimacy of Spanish rule collapsed almost overnight. Across the empire, a question emerged. Quiet at first, then urgent. If the king no longer ruled, who held authority? For Venezuela's colonial society, this was not an abstract concern. The entire structure of power rested on loyalty to the crown. Without a legitimate monarch, the foundation of governance weakened. News traveled slowly, but when it arrived in Caracas, it unsettled everything. Spanish officials insisted on obedience. They claimed authority still flowed from Spain, even in Chalice, but Creole leaders, educated and attentive to events abroad, saw something else. A vacuum. For the first time, Spanish control appeared vulnerable. Caracas, in early 1810, was a city accustomed to restraint. Its narrow streets and tiled roofs had witnessed little open rebellion. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms of church bells and market days, tension grew. Conversations changed. In private homes, Creole elites debated legitimacy and loyalty. They spoke cautiously, aware that words could still carry consequences. But the question returned again and again. Should Venezuela be governed by officials appointed by a fallen power or by its own people in the name of the absent king? On April 19, 1810, this uncertainty crystallized. It was Holy Thursday, a day already heavy with religious significance. The city gathered near the central plaza. Spanish authorities expected ceremony and obedience. Instead, they encountered resistance calm, deliberate, and decisive. Leading citizens of Caracas confronted the Spanish Captain General, Vicente Emparan. They did not attack him. They did not shout. They questioned his authority. When Emparan addressed the crowd from a balcony, asking whether they wished him to continue ruling, the answer came not from his mouth, but from the people below. They said no. With that simple refusal, colonial authority in Caracas collapsed. Emparan resigned. A new governing body was formed, the Supreme Junta of Caracas. Its members declared they would rule in the name of Ferdinand VII until his return. But the meaning beneath those words was unmistakable. Power had shifted. For the first time in Venezuelan history, governance rested not with Spain, but with local leaders. The revolution, if it could yet be called that, was cautious. No independence was declared. No flags were raised. The junta framed its actions as temporary and loyal, but the effect was profound. Once authority moved into local hands, it could not easily be returned. The spark had been struck. News of Caracas's actions spread rapidly to other cities and provinces. Some followed its example, forming their own junta. Others resisted, remaining loyal to Spanish officials. Venezuela fractured along political, regional, and social lines. The country was no longer unified under colonial rule, but it was not yet united in rebellion. Within the UNT itself, divisions appeared. Some members favored gradual reform, hoping to negotiate autonomy without severing ties to Spain. Others, influenced by Enlightenment ideas and events abroad, believed independence was inevitable. Among these voices was a young aristocrat who had already traveled Europe, witnessed revolution, and returned with a vision larger than Venezuela alone. His name was Simon Bolivar. Atistache Bolivar was not yet the legendary figure history would remember. He was passionate, impatient, and deeply convinced that colonial rule could not be reformed, only ended. In the months following April 19th, the junta sent diplomatic missions abroad, seeking recognition and support. They opened ports, loosened trade restrictions, and encouraged debate. For the first time, public political discussion emerged. Newspapers circulated ideas previously whispered. People argued about sovereignty, rights, and representation. Churches and plazas became spaces of discussion as much as devotion, but enthusiasm was uneven. Many feared instability. Others feared retaliation. The lower classes, indigenous people, enslaved Africans, rural laborers watched cautiously. They had seen elites shift power before, without improving their lives. Trust did not come easily. Still, the old certainty was gone. Spain attempted to reassert control. Loyalist forces prepared. The possibility of violence loomed. What had begun as a response to European crisis was becoming something more dangerous and more permanent. The spark of 1810 did not yet ignite a full revolution, but it lit the fuse. Venezuela had crossed a threshold. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how far it would go, and at what cost. The age of obedience had ended. The age of struggle had begun. The spark of 1810 had lit a new awareness. But awareness alone does not create a nation. What followed was not a clean ascent toward freedom, but a difficult passage filled with doubt, division, and fragile hope. In the months after the formation of the Supreme Junta, Venezuela stood in an uncertain space, no longer firmly under Spanish control, yet not fully independent. Power rested in local hands, but legitimacy remained contested. The future felt open, but also dangerous. Debate intensified within Caracas and other major towns. Representatives gathered to decide what shape this new political reality should take. Some argued for continued loyalty to the Spanish crown, ruling temporarily until stability returned to Europe. Others insisted that the moment could not be wasted, that independence, once delayed, might never return. Slowly, the second view gained strength. On July 5, 1811, representatives from several provinces assembled in Caracas made a decision that would alter the course of history. With solemn resolve, they signed a declaration severing ties with Spain. Venezuela declared independence. It was a bold act. Venezuela became the first Spanish colony in South America to formally break away from imperial rule. The declaration spoke of sovereignty, natural rights, and self-government, ideas drawn from Enlightenment, thought, and revolutionary precedent. A new nation was proclaimed. Yet, from its first breath, the First Republic of Venezuela was fragile. The declaration did not unite the country. Several provinces refused to join, remaining loyal to Spain. Royalist forces still held territory. Communication was slow. Resources were scarce. More troubling still, independence had been declared by a narrow segment of society. The Republic was largely led by Creole elites, educated property-owning men who believed deeply in liberty, yet hesitated to extend it fully to all. Enslaved Africans remained enslaved. Indigenous communities saw little immediate change. Many rural people felt disconnected from debates held in distant cities. The Republic spoke the language of freedom, but its reach was uneven. Internally, the new government struggled. It adopted a federal system, granting significant autonomy to provinces. In theory, this respected local authority. In practice, it weakened coordination at a moment when unity was essential. Disagreements slowed decision-making. Resources were poorly managed. Military organization was inconsistent. Externally, danger loomed. Spain had not accepted the loss of its colony. Royalist forces regrouped, supported by loyal provinces, and reinforced from nearby territories. The war that followed was not a single campaign, but a series of scattered confrontations, often brutal, often confused. Nature itself seemed to turn against the Republic. In March 1812, a powerful earthquake struck Caracas and surrounding regions. Buildings collapsed, churches crumbled, thousands died. Too many, the disaster felt apocalyptic. Royalist priests seized the moment. They preached that the earthquake was divine punishment, God's judgment against rebellion. In a deeply religious society, these sermons carried weight. Fear spread. Faith wavered. The Republic's authority weakened further. Amid this chaos, Spanish forces advanced. Cities fell one by one. Supplies ran short. Morale collapsed. At the center of the storm stood Francisco de Miranda, a veteran revolutionary who had fought in the American and French revolutions. He had returned to Venezuela filled with hope, only to confront the brutal reality of internal division and external pressure. In July 1812, faced with inevitable defeat, Miranda chose to surrender, believing it would spare the population further suffering. It did not. The First Republic collapsed less than a year after its birth. Spanish control was restored. Leaders were imprisoned or exiled. Miranda himself was arrested and sent to Spain, where he would die in captivity. Many who had embraced independence now faced punishment, confiscation, or death. Hope faded. For ordinary people, the brief experiment in freedom seemed to confirm their worst fears. Independence had brought war, destruction, and loss, not stability. Yet even in defeat, something had changed. The idea of independence had been spoken aloud. It had been written, declared, and defended. However briefly, it could not be erased. Among those who fled was Simon Bolivar, exiled, bitter, and determined. Bolivar reflected on the failure. He did not see independence itself as the mistake. They saw weakness, division, hesitation, and compromise. From exile, he wrote words that would echo through history. More than anyone, we have been victims of deception. Bolivar believed the struggle had only begun. The loss of the First Republic did not end the revolution. It hardened it. Those who returned to Spanish rule did so with resentment. Those who escaped carried lessons learned in failure. Venezuela entered a dark interlude, a time of repression and uncertainty. But beneath the surface, resistance survived. The Republic had fallen, but the idea of freedom remained alive, carried in memory, anger, and resolve. The war for independence would not be swift. It would not be clean, and it would not be won without immense sacrifice. The Declaration of Independence had been made, and it had been lost. But history had turned, and it would not turn back. Even in moments of great upheaval, history often pauses to shape the life of a single individual. In Venezuela, that individual was Simon Bolivar, a man whose vision, energy, and determination would define the struggle for independence, and whose name would become inseparable from the variety of freedom in Latin America. Bolivar was born on July 24, 1783, into a wealthy Creole family in Caracas. His parents were part of the colonial elite, owners of land and slaves, deeply connected to Spanish culture and society. Yet Bolivar's childhood was marked by early loss. Orphaned of both parents by the age of 9, he was raised by relatives who emphasized education, manners, and social standing, but who could not shelter him from the world's realities. Even in youth, Bolivar was curious about the wider world. He studied languages, history, and philosophy. He read of revolutions in distant lands, America, France, and of men who had dared to reshape the world through thought, courage, and decisive action. These stories left an indelible mark, planting the seeds of ambition that would later guide him across Venezuela and beyond. Travel further shaped him. In his early 20s, Bolivar journeyed to Europe, a world of salons, wars, and shifting alliances. He witnessed firsthand the chaos of Napoleon's campaigns and the fragility of monarchy. In Spain, he saw the political vacuum created by Ferdinand VII's captivity and the debates over loyalty and sovereignty. Across Europe, he observed how ideas could move people, in seats, chain, and even topple thrones. These experiences crystallized Bolivar's conviction. The Spanish colonies in the Americas could no longer wait for distant rulers to act. Freedom, he believed, would have to be claimed by those who lived in the land itself. Yet, Bolivar was neither naive nor impulsive. He understood the immense obstacles ahead. He returned to Venezuela in 1807, a young man of passion and vision, aware that the society he returned to was divided, fragile, and still bound by centuries of colonial hierarchy. When the spark of April 19, 1810, ignited Caracas, Bolivar was deeply involved in its unfolding. Though he did not yet hold formal power, he watched carefully, learning from the successes and failures of others. He observed how fleeting authority could be, how fragile unity was, and how quickly hope could turn to despair. The collapse of the First Republic in 1812 left Bolivar exiled, bitter, and determined. He had seen the consequences of division, the dangers of inexperience, and the importance of decisive action. These lessons would shape every decision he made in the years to come. From exile, Bolivar began to craft his vision of liberation, not just for Venezuela, but for all of Spanish South America. He imagined a continent free from imperial rule, united by a common cause, and governed by principles of justice and self-determination. He understood, however, that ideals alone would not succeed. Strategy, alliances, discipline, and courage were essential. Bolivar's campaigns were long and difficult. Returning to Venezuela, he led troops through rivers, mountains, and plains, enduring heat, storms, disease, and hunger. Battles were often hard-fought, victories rare, and losses frequent. Yet Bolivar's presence inspired loyalty and courage. Soldiers followed him not merely out of duty, but because he embodied the cause itself. Determination made tangible, vision made visible. Over time, Bolivar's reputation grew. He became known as El Libertador, the Liberator. In towns and villages, the name was spoken with reverence, hope, and sometimes fear. To his followers, he was the embodiment of independence. To his enemies, he was the relentless force challenging centuries of control. Yet, Bolivar was more complex than legend suggests. He was not universally beloved. His decisions were often harsh. He demanded obedience and loyalty, sometimes punishing dissent severely. He faced personal doubt, despair, and exhaustion. He endured betrayal by allies, setbacks on the battlefield, and the constant weight of expectation. Even as he achieved victories, Bolivar remained conscious of the fragility of what he was building. He understood that independence required not only the expulsion of Spanish forces, but the creation of a functioning society, one capable of governing itself amid deep social, racial, and regional divisions. His vision extended beyond Venezuela. Bolivar imagined a federation of liberated states, united by common principles, stretching across the northern part of South America. He believed that regional unity was essential to prevent external powers from intervening and to ensure stability in newly independent lands. Yet this vision faced obstacles, local rivalries, divergent interests, and the persistent challenge of transforming centuries of colonial hierarchy. In reflecting on Bolivar's life, it becomes clear that the myth and the man are inseparable. The myth speaks of triumph, courage, and destiny. The man reveals strategy, patience, and human struggle. Both are necessary to understand the profound impact he had on Venezuela and the continent. By Bolivar had led successful campaigns across Venezuela and neighboring territories, achieving the liberation of vast regions. Yet his work was far from complete. Political instability persisted, social divisions remained, and the task of building lasting institutions loomed large. Even as Bolivar's victories inspired generations, they carried a quiet truth. Freedom is never given easily, nor fully, nor without cost. It is sustained only through courage, perseverance, and the willingness to confront both external enemies and internal challenges. For Venezuela, Bolivar became the central figure in the story of independence. A man whose life bridged vision and action, ideals and reality. The nation's identity, its aspirations, and its enduring struggles are inseparable from his presence. Yet to understand him fully, one must see beyond the myth to the man. A deeply human figure, shaped by circumstance, experience, and conviction. In the quiet of the plains, the forests, and the mountains where Bolivar marched, the echo of his determination remains. His story is not simply one of victories and titles, but of the idea of independence itself, fragile, contested, and eternal. And so, as the early republic faltered and revived, as battles raged and treaties were signed, the figure of Bolivar became both guide and symbol. The struggle for Venezuela's freedom was far from over, but the path had a leader whose vision would carry it forward. Even now, centuries later, his name continues to resonate, a reminder of the possibilities that arise when courage meets history, when ideals meet action, and when a nation begins to define itself not by who rules it, but by who its people choose to be. Once the idea of independence had taken root in Venezuela, it needed more than words to survive. It needed movement, strategy, and endurance. It needed the campaigns of liberation, long, grueling journeys across mountains, rivers, and plains, led by those who believed the nation could be free. Simon Bolivar, understood this. Ideas alone could not defeat Spanish authority. What was required was action. Bold, disciplined, and relentless. In Ibaeza, Bolivar returned to Venezuela from exile in the Caribbean, determined to reclaim the territories lost after the fall of the First Republic. The country had endured years of repression under loyalist forces, yet discontent simmered beneath the surface. Local populations had grown weary of imposed control, and many were willing to support the cause of liberation. Bolivar began what would come to be called the Admirable Campaign. The name itself suggested precision, strategy, and resolve. The journey was arduous. Bolivar and his forces moved through dense forests, high mountains, and sweltering plains, often under threat of disease, hunger, and enemy ambush. The Andean mountains presented one of the greatest challenges. Soldiers crossed peaks in the cold, carrying supplies and weapons over paths where even horses struggled. In these moments, survival required more than courage. It demanded knowledge of the land, the ability to endure hardship, and trust in leadership. Local support proved crucial. Villages and towns along the route provided guides, food, and intelligence. People who had witnessed the collapse of the First Republic were cautious, but many saw in Bolivar a leader capable of achieving what others could not. He inspired loyalty not through coercion alone, but through vision and persistence. Battles were decisive, yet costly. The forces of liberation confronted well-trained Spanish troops, equipped with weapons and fortified positions. The victories were often hard-won. Towns changed hands multiple times. Civilians were caught between armies, suffering from raids, shortages, and fear. Even so, Bolivar's forces pressed forward, determined to reclaim the symbolic heart of Caracas. By August 1813, Bolivar's troops entered Caracas. The city, long under royalist control, welcomed the liberator with celebration and cautious hope. He proclaimed the restoration of the Republic, declaring the war to the death, a pledge that the struggle for independence would not end until Spain's forces were expelled entirely. Yet, Bolivar's campaigns were not limited to military conquest. They were also efforts to mobilize society. He sought to unify provinces, integrate indigenous peoples, and free Africans into the cause, and build local militias. He understood that victory would require both force and popular support. The war, however, was far from straightforward. Royalist forces regrouped, launching counterattacks across coastal and inland regions. Battles were fluid, with territories frequently changing hands. The environment itself was as much an adversary as the enemy. Tropical rains flooded plains, rivers became impassable, and disease took a constant toll. Despite these hardships, Bolivar's leadership endured. He led by example, sharing in the hardships of his soldiers, planning movements with careful attention to terrain, weather, and supply lines. His ability to inspire loyalty, even among those who had known only defeat, became a defining feature of the campaign. The victories accumulated slowly but surely. Key battles in regions such as Los Andes, Merida, and Caracas demonstrated the growing strength of the independence movement. Each victory strengthened morale, expanded recruitment, and undermined Spanish authority. It became increasingly clear that liberation was not a fleeting hope, but an achievable goal. The campaign extended beyond Venezuela. Bolivar's vision of continental unity required moving forces through New Granada, Modrande, Colombia, and other territories. The logistical challenges multiplied long marches across unfamiliar lands, negotiations with local leaders, and coordination among dispersed units. Yet, each success built momentum and legitimacy. Even with victories, the cost was profound. Soldiers, civilians, and communities suffered immense hardships. Families were displaced. Farms and towns were damaged. Disease and hunger continued to claim lives. Liberation was not romantic. It was painfully human, shaped by endurance and resilience as much as by strategy. By the end of these campaigns, Bolivar had achieved a remarkable feat: the partial restoration of the Republic and consolidation of key territories under the banner of independence. Yet he understood that the struggle was far from over. Spain retained forces, loyalist sentiment persisted, and unity among provinces was fragile. The campaigns of 1813 to 1814 demonstrated a central truth. Independence required persistence, courage, and the willingness to endure adversity over years, not months. Bolívar had transformed abstract ideals into action, laying the foundation for the eventual liberation of Venezuela and neighboring territories. The legacy of these campaigns is not measured solely in territory gained or battles won. It is measured in the determination and vision they inspired, in the belief that a nation could define itself, rule itself, and claim freedom against overwhelming odds. The campaigns of liberation set the stage for the next chapter, one in which the ideals of Bolívar and the people of Venezuela would face even greater trials, ultimately shaping the nation's future. The path to freedom is rarely swift. For Venezuela, independence was not achieved in a single year, nor in a single campaign. It unfolded over more than a decade, shaped by endurance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that often seemed just out of reach. After the partial successes of 1813 and 1814, the Republic faced renewed threats. Spain had regrouped, loyalist armies returned with greater organization, intent on reclaiming territory and extinguishing the fragile flame of independence. Provinces that had welcomed Bolívar's campaigns now faced devastation from counterattack. Bornate villages were abandoned, and families fled into mountains and forests to escape the violence. The Republic had survived, but barely. In these dark years, survival itself became a revolutionary act. Bolívar and his allies recognized that persistence was as important as victory. They understood that the Spanish forces were strong, but their own resolve, fueled by hope, unity, and the vision of freedom, could not be broken. During this period, Bolívar consolidated both military strategy and political leadership. He organized disciplined armies capable of enduring the harsh Venezuelan terrain, the sweltering llanos, the treacherous rivers, and the Andean highlands. He encouraged local militias and recruited volunteers who had witnessed the suffering caused by royalist retaliation. Every march, every supply line, every engagement was carefully planned. Even small victories were celebrated, because they reinforced the idea that liberation was possible. Yet the struggle was far from linear. The Republic faced internal divisions. Provinces often disagreed on strategy, resources were scarce, and local rivalries threatened cohesion. Bolívar's leadership was tested not only against the Spanish forces, but against the challenge of uniting diverse regions and peoples under a single cause. He relied on persuasion, negotiation, and sometimes strict measures to maintain focus on the ultimate goal. The turning point came with the crossing of the Andes in 1819, a daring and arduous maneuver that became legendary. Bolívar and his troops moved across rugged mountains and freezing altitudes, facing exhaustion, frostbite, and hunger. It was a feat that required meticulous planning and extraordinary courage, for failure would have meant the collapse of the independence movement. Yet, Bolívar succeeded, surprising Spanish forces and achieving a decisive advantage. This campaign led directly to the Battle of Boyacá, a pivotal moment that opened the path to liberation beyond Venezuela, particularly into New Granada, modern-day Colombia. Victory there strengthened morale and signaled to allies and enemies alike that the independence movement could endure and prevail. Bolívar returned to Venezuela with renewed momentum. He understood that military success alone could not secure lasting independence. He worked to unify liberated regions under a common political framework, establish governance, and encourage social cohesion, all while continuing to confront loyalist resistance. The final battles were hard-fought, marked by both brilliance and tragedy. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders sacrificed life and property in pursuit of an uncertain dream. By 1821, after years of campaigning, setbacks, and strategy, Venezuela had achieved the liberation of much of its territory. The Battle of Carabobo became symbolic of this triumph. Bolívar's forces defeated the royalist army decisively, ensuring that and the surrounding provinces would remain in the hands of the Republic. After this victory, Spanish control was effectively broken in most of the country, though skirmishes and resistance persisted for several years. The liberation of Venezuela did not occur in isolation. Bolívar's vision extended to a broader South American context, influencing the independence of neighboring territories such as Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. The campaigns in Venezuela became the foundation for the Gran Colombia Project, an ambitious effort to unite liberated territories under a single federation for stability, cooperation, and defense. Yet even in triumph, the cost of freedom was evident. Entire regions had been devastated, communities disrupted, and countless lives lost. Slavery persisted in some areas, and social inequalities remained. Independence did not immediately create equality, prosperity, or unity. It created opportunity, responsibility, and the chance to rebuild. Bolívar himself was a figure of both admiration and complexity. Celebrated as El Libertador, he embodied determination and vision, yet he faced political challenges, betrayals, and the immense burden of leadership. His victories were hard-earned, but they laid the foundation for a nation capable of self-determination. By the mid-1820s, Venezuela had emerged as an independent republic, no longer under Spanish rule. The nation had endured conquest, colonial oppression, failed uprisings, and years of war, yet it had survived. Its people had learned endurance, courage, and the power of shared ideals. The land itself, shaped by centuries of geographies, culture, and struggle, now bore a new identity, that of a free nation. The long struggle and final victory of Venezuela's independence left a legacy that extended far beyond borders. It demonstrated the interplay of ideas, leadership, and human perseverance. It revealed the necessity of vision, planning, and resilience. And it proved that even after centuries of colonial rule, a people's desire for self-determination could ultimately prevail. As Venezuela moved forward, it carried with it the lessons of struggle. That independence is never granted easily, that unity is fragile, and that freedom demands vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. Bolívar and his campaigns had not only liberated a nation, but had shaped its identity, inspiring generations to come with the enduring story of resilience and hope. The nation that rose from this long struggle was no longer merely a collection of towns, rivers, and mountains. It was a living story of people who had endured conquest, disease, division, and defeat, and yet had emerged determined to define their own destiny. Venezuela's final victory was not the end of its history, merely a new beginning, but it was a beginning forged in courage, endurance, and the profound belief that freedom, however delayed, was worth every sacrifice. Victory on the battlefield brought relief, but it did not bring certainty. For Venezuela, the achievement of independence in the early 1820s marked the end of Spanish rule. Yet the task of building a nation had only just begun. The land that had endured conquest, rebellion, and liberation now faced the daunting challenge of governance. Towns, villages, and provinces needed administration. Roads and trade networks had been disrupted. Agriculture, devastated by war, had to be restored. Social systems fractured over years of conflict required rebuilding. The Republic had freedom, but it had not yet learned stability. Simón Bolívar, the liberator, understood this clearly. He believed that independence without order would be fragile. He sought to create structures of government capable of sustaining the Republic, balancing local autonomy with national unity, and ensuring that the sacrifices of war were not wasted. Yet, the task was enormous. The Republic inherited a society long stratified by race, class, and geography, with tensions simmering beneath the surface. The new nation faced political challenges almost immediately. Regional divisions persisted. Provinces that had fought alongside Bolívar were often reluctant to cede authority to a central government. Local leaders sought to protect their own power and resources, sometimes clashing with national priorities. The tension between centralization and federalism became a defining struggle for the fledgling republic. At the same time, Venezuela grappled with economic difficulties. War had disrupted agriculture, trade, and commerce. Cacao production, once the backbone of the economy, needed to be revitalized. Ports required reopening. Infrastructure repairs were urgent, yet resources were scarce. The Republic faced debt, inflation, and the challenge of financing both governance and defense. These pressures required careful management, often forcing leaders to make unpopular decisions. Social reconstruction proved equally difficult. Decades of colonial rule had entrenched inequality. Indigenous communities remained marginalized. Freed Africans and their descendants sought recognition and opportunity, but societal structures were slow to accommodate them. The Republic faced the delicate task of integrating diverse populations while ensuring stability and order. Bolivar and other leaders attempted institutional reforms. Constitutions were drafted, legal systems established, and administrative frameworks created to manage provinces, cities, and rural areas. Education and public services were promoted, with the goal of fostering informed citizenship. Yet, implementation was uneven. Communication across the country was slow, resources limited, and resistance to change persistent. Military readiness remained a priority. Even after Spanish forces were largely expelled, threats persisted. Loyalist uprisings, border disputes, and political rivalries required vigilance. Bolivar maintained an army capable of responding to these challenges, understanding that the survival of the Republic depended not only on governance, but on the continued defense of its hard-won independence. The process of nation-building revealed a tension between ideals and reality. Bolivar's vision of a united and prosperous republic sometimes clashed with local customs, entrenched interests, and human limitations. Policies meant to foster equality or central authority could provoke resentment. Decisions taken for long-term stability could spark short-term unrest. Each choice carried consequences, some predictable, others unforeseen. Yet amid these challenges, Venezuela began to develop an identity distinct from its colonial past. Citizens learned to think of themselves as participants in a shared political project. Symbols, rituals, and narratives emerged. Flags, national holidays, public ceremonies that reminded people of the hard-won independence and the responsibility it entailed. Cultural life, too, began to reflect the nation's transformation. Literature, music, and public discourse increasingly celebrated Venezuelan identity, blending indigenous, African, and European influences. Markets and ports reopened, restoring economic networks, while also allowing new ideas, trade, and exchange to flow. The Republic, though fragile, began to breathe as a living society. Yet the challenges of governance were constant reminders that freedom alone was not enough. Social inequality persisted. Regional rivalries flared. The economy struggled to recover from the devastation of war. Bolivar and his successors realized that the Republic required not only political and military leadership, but also the cultivation of social cohesion, civic responsibility, and economic resilience. Despite the difficulties, the nation endured. Venezuela had achieved what generations had dreamed: sovereignty. It now faced the task of making that sovereignty meaningful, translating the abstract ideals of independence into the lived reality of law, order, opportunity, and stability. Bolivar's legacy during this period was profound. He had led a liberation that spanned the continent, yet he remained deeply aware of the fragility of freedom. His final years in leadership were marked not only by military campaigns but by the careful shaping of institutions, the management of conflict, and the attempt to leave Venezuela capable of sustaining itself once he was gone. By the mid-1820s, Venezuela was no longer merely a collection of provinces struggling against foreign rule. It was a nation imperfect, fragile, yet alive. Its challenges were immense, but so too were the lessons learned through decades of conquest, rebellion, and endurance. The Republic had emerged, tempered by struggle, inspired by ideals, and determined to survive. Nation-building in Venezuela was not a single act, but a continuous process. It required patience, wisdom, and compromise. It demanded the willingness to endure hardship, address divisions, and create structures capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. In facing these challenges, the young Republic learned that independence was not a destination, but a journey one that would continue for generations. The story of Venezuela's early nationhood teaches a quiet, enduring truth. Freedom is fragile. It must be defended, nurtured, and constantly renewed. Independence provides opportunity, but it also carries responsibility. The responsibility to build, to govern, and to unite. And it is in this delicate balance that Venezuela began to find its identity as a nation. A nation born of struggle, tempered by resilience, and guided by the vision of those who dared to dream of liberty. The echoes of Venezuela's long struggle for independence carried forward across centuries, not as distant memory, but as living forces shaping the nation's identity. The republic that emerged from the age of Bolivar transformed over time, facing triumphs and setbacks in equal measure. In the modern era, Venezuela's legacy and challenges reflect a tapestry woven from oil wealth, political passions, social fractures, and competing visions of what the nation should become. In the 20th century, Venezuela's identity became inseparable from oil. Vast reserves buried deep beneath the earth made Venezuela one of the world's most petroleum-rich nations. For decades, oil revenues funded public services, infrastructure, and government programs. The country became a major exporter to global markets, linking its fortunes to the rhythms of international demand. In prosperous years, cities grew, roads were built, and education expanded. Yet this dependence also created a vulnerability. When oil prices sank or production faltered, the economy shook in response. By the latter half of the century, political movements arose that sought to channel oil wealth into broader social transformation. These movements questioned established elites and called for greater equity, inspiring hope among many Venezuelans who had long felt marginalized. In 1999, a charismatic figure named Hugo Chavez emerged as the leader of this new wave. He called his project the Bolivarian Revolution, in homage to the independence hero Simon Bolivar. Chavez promised a new era, one that redistributed wealth and reclaimed national sovereignty against foreign influence. Chavez's tenure brought dramatic change. He rewrote the constitution, expanded social programs, and nationalized key industries. Supporters celebrated his efforts to reduce poverty and challenge entrenched power. Critics warned that the political system was becoming increasingly centralized and authoritarian. Over time, polarization deepened between those who saw Chavez as a champion of the people and those who feared he was undermining democratic institutions. When Chavez died in 2013, his deputy Nicolas Maduro assumed leadership. Maduro inherited both the loyalty of Chavez's base and the burdens of a faltering economy. Oil prices had dropped sharply, reducing government revenue. Inflation soared. Basic goods became scarce. Many Venezuelans struggled to meet daily needs. These economic hardships triggered waves of protests and rising social tension. Political conflict intensified. The opposition accused the government of manipulating elections and suppressing dissent. Independent observers and international organizations criticized the fairness of electoral processes, especially those in 2024, which many Venezuelans and outside analysts regarded as deeply flawed. According to parallel tallies and opposition claims, the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had won, while government-controlled electoral authorities announced incumbent Nicolas Maduro as the victor, a result widely disputed and condemned by international bodies for lacking transparency. Public dissatisfaction grew into widespread protests, met by state security forces and allied militias known as collectives. Reports of arrests, detentions, and violence became common, deepening fears that the nation's democratic framework was eroding. By the mid-2020s, Venezuela stood at a crossroads. Years of economic contraction had sapped public confidence. Infrastructure, including electricity grids and oil facilities, deteriorated from chronic underinvestment and mismanagement. In 2024, widespread power outages, part of a long-running energy crisis, left communities without electricity for extended periods, disrupting daily life and highlighting systemic weaknesses in public services. At the same time, the country became a focal point in global geopolitics. Venezuela's oil reserves, among the largest in the world, remained central not only to its economy but to international energy markets. Debates raged over control of these resources and foreign influence in domestic affairs. Tensions with the United States, which had long been strained by political disagreements and sanctions, escalated sharply. In early January 2026, U.S. forces launched a military operation in Caracas that resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, who was taken to the United States on narco-terrorism and drug trafficking charges. The operation marked a dramatic shift in international engagement with Venezuela, framed by U.S. officials as an effort against criminal networks, but widely criticized by others as an unprecedented intervention in a sovereign state. In the immediate aftermath, Venezuela entered a period of heightened uncertainty. Interim leadership took charge under Delcy Rodriguez, sworn in by the National Assembly after Maduro's removal. While some welcomed the transition as an opportunity for democratic renewal, others feared it would lead to further instability. Armed militias increased their presence in urban centers, aiming to suppress dissent and maintain governmental authority amid widespread unease. Efforts toward reconciliation began tentatively. In early 2026, the new government announced the release of multiple political prisoners, including opposition activists, journalists, and foreign nationals, describing the move as a gesture toward peace and national unity. Yet these developments unfolded against a backdrop of international controversy. Questions about sovereignty, legality, and the future of Venezuelan governance dominated global discourse, while families across the nation watched with apprehension and hope as familiar political structures gave way to a new, unpredictable landscape. Venezuelan society itself reflects profound transformations. Decades of hardship have prompted waves of migration. Millions of Venezuelans, doctors, teachers, engineers, and laborers, have sought new lives abroad, creating one of the largest displacement movements in Latin America's recent history. Communities in neighboring countries and beyond have absorbed these populations, forming diasporas that maintain deep cultural ties to home while building new lives elsewhere. At the same time, debates about national identity continue. Some yearn for the promises of social justice once articulated in the Bolivarian era. Others emphasize the need for institutional reform, economic diversification, and strengthening democratic rule of law. Indigenous communities seek greater recognition of cultural rights and equitable development. Younger generations question the political legacies of both past revolution and present intervention, striving to imagine a future beyond polarization. In the midst of this, everyday life persists. Markets open before dawn. Children attend classes where they can. Families gather around meals. Music plays in plazas and cafes, in cities and villages alike. People find ways to endure, to laugh, to hold fast, to relationships that transcend politics. Legacy, in this sense, is not just history written in textbooks. It is lived in the quiet rhythms of daily life, in resilient communities, in debates over future directions, in the enduring belief of millions that the nation they call home is larger than any single leader or ideology. Venezuela's story remains unfinished. Its past resilience informs its present struggles, and its people, shaped by centuries of challenge and change, continue to seek a path toward stability, justice, and shared prosperity. In the quiet dusk of Caracas streets or the early light over the Orinoco River, the echoes of history meet the promise of what might yet be a nation still defining itself, ever mindful that the legacy of freedom is unceasing work, not a resting place. The story of Venezuela in the modern age cannot be told without the presence of oil. Its discovery, rise, and eventual decline as the dominant force shaping economy, society, and politics. For much of the 20th century, oil was both blessing and burden, a source of immense wealth, and later, of deep instability. When vast petroleum reserves were first exploited on a commercial scale in the early 1900s, Venezuela's landscape changed forever. Foreign companies, particularly from the United States, built infrastructure, drilled wells, and exported oil across the world. By the 1950s, Venezuela was one of the largest oil producers globally, supplying a significant portion of U.S. crude imports and fueling rapid economic growth at home. This era turned cities like Caracas and Maracaibo into symbols of prosperity and opportunity. Oil was so central that it came to define the nation's identity. It powered exports, underwrote government revenue, and reshaped domestic life. Yet this concentration of wealth also created a structural dependence on a single resource, which made the economy vulnerable to changes in global markets. Economists would later describe this pattern: heavy reliance on oil at the expense of agriculture and industry as a form of Dutch disease. In 1976, Venezuela took a decisive step by nationalizing its oil industry, bringing foreign operations under state control through the creation of Petróleos de Venezuela, SAP. The goal was clear: to ensure that the nation, not foreign corporations, would benefit from its natural wealth. For a time, the strategy appeared to work. Oil revenues funded education, healthcare, transportation projects, and subsidies. Venezuela became one of Latin America's most influential states, buoyed by wealth that flowed from its soil. Yet even as the state claimed ownership, the country's dependence on oil deepened. By the early 2000s, oil accounted for the vast majority of export earnings and a large share of government revenue, often exceeding 80% of exports and more than half of public spending. When oil prices were high, The government had funds flowing. When prices fell, the cracks in the economic foundation widened. The turn of the century brought new political forces to the forefront. Hugo Chavez, elected president Inigo Jojo, expanded state control over oil and linked petroleum revenue directly to broad social programs aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. For many Venezuelans, these programs brought tangible benefits. Schools, clinics, and housing projects emerged in regions long overlooked. Chavez insisted that oil wealth should improve the lives of ordinary people rather than line the pockets of elites. But this period also introduced long-term challenges. Much of the nation's oil income was spent on immediate social programs, without creating durable economic buffers or diversification. PDVSA itself became increasingly politicized, as experienced technical and managerial staff were replaced with political appointees and loyalists, undermining institutional continuity and expertise. Investment in maintenance and modernization declined, even as production infrastructure aged. This pattern weakened Venezuela's ability to sustain high levels of output when global conditions shifted. When global oil prices plummeted after 2014, the Venezuelan economy began to unravel. Oil revenues collapsed, government spending outpaced income, and shortages of foreign currency made it difficult to import essential goods. Without other strong industries to cushion the blow, economic contraction accelerated. Over the decade that followed, Venezuela experienced one of the most severe economic crises in the modern era. GDP shrank dramatically, and inflation soared, wiping out savings and incomes. By the early 2020s, the effects were visible everywhere. Fuel shortages struck despite vast known reserves, with gasoline sometimes hard to find at filling stations, a stark paradox for a country sitting atop the world's largest estimated proven oil reserves. Power plants and industrial facilities suffered from underinvestment, contributing to periodic blackouts that disrupted daily life and hampered economic activity. Social impacts were severe. Families struggled to afford basic goods. Hospitals faced shortages of medicine and supplies. Millions of Venezuelans, doctors, engineers, teachers, and laborers left the country in search of opportunity elsewhere, creating one of the largest waves of migration in the region's history. Economic contraction, hyperinflation, and political instability combined to shape an irreversible transformation of Venezuelan society. Political tensions ran deep during this period. Opponents of the ruling government accused it of suppressing dissent, manipulating electoral processes, and concentrating power, while the government argued that external pressures and sanctions were designed to undermine national sovereignty. In 2024, widely disputed presidential elections sparked mass protests and international criticism over the fairness and legitimacy of results. The country's oil sector, once the pillar of its economy, became a focus of both internal struggle and international contention as production and exports declined. Political actors and foreign powers eyed Venezuela's remaining reserves for strategic leverage. In early 2026, geopolitical dynamics shifted dramatically when the United States launched a military operation that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, framed officially as a campaign against organized crime and narco-terrorism, but also linked to broader objectives over oil control. Following Maduro's ouster, U.S. authorities announced plans to export millions of barrels of Venezuelan crude under arrangements intended to benefit both nations, while U.S. oil companies prepared to re-enter the country's energy sector. Efforts were underway to rehabilitate deteriorated infrastructure and restore production levels, though analysts noted that rebuilding could take years and require enormous investment. Simultaneously, Venezuela's geopolitical position became even more contested. China, long a major buyer of Venezuelan oil, and other partners, criticized external involvement in the nation's affairs, arguing that sovereignty should be respected and that economic coercion would deepen hardship at home and abroad. Cuba, heavily reliant on Venezuelan oil for its own fragile economy, condemned the intervention as an assault on sovereignty, illustrating the regional ripple effects of Venezuela's crises. In 2026, Venezuela remains in economic limbo, a nation with vast natural wealth, yet struggling to rebuild an economy that once dazzled the world. Oil, which once seemed like a promise of unending prosperity, has instead become a reminder of both potential and peril. Its fields, pipelines, and refineries are symbols of an enduring paradox that resource wealth can enrich, but also destabilize a nation when governance, investment, and diversification fall short. The legacy of Venezuela's oil era is neither triumph nor tragedy alone, but a complex blend of ambition, crisis, resilience, and hope. In quiet towns and bustling ports alike, people continue to live, adapt, and dream, seeking ways to transform their nation's vast potential into a future that is stable, inclusive, and free from the volatility that has defined much of its recent past. The story of modern Venezuela cannot be told without the figure of Hugo Chavez, a man who would redefine the nation's politics, society, and identity in ways both celebrated and contested. His rise to power in 1999 marked the beginning of what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, an ambitious political project inspired by the ideals of Simon Bolivar, the very figure whose vision had led Venezuela to independence more than a century earlier. Chavez emerged from a background that combined military discipline with social awareness. Born in 1954 in Sabanata, a small town in western Venezuela, he joined the military at a young age. Even as a young officer, he was influenced by the poverty and inequality he witnessed in rural Venezuela, and by stories of Bolivar and other Latin American revolutionaries. These experiences shaped his vision of leadership, one that linked nationalism, social justice, and strong centralized authority. In the 1990s, Venezuela faced economic instability, corruption, and public disillusionment. Despite vast oil wealth, much of the population experienced poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. Chavez capitalized on this discontent. He presented himself as a voice for ordinary people, promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth to improve education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and to redistribute power away from the entrenched elites. Chavez's victory in the 1998 presidential election was both decisive and symbolic. He took office in 1999, initiating sweeping changes. Within months, he oversaw the drafting of a new constitution, which expanded presidential powers, restructured government institutions, and introduced social programs aimed at addressing inequality. He renamed the country's political project the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, directly connecting his policies to the legacy of the independence hero. The Bolivarian Revolution was characterized by a combination of popular programs, state intervention in the economy, and consolidation of political authority. Chavez launched initiatives to provide free healthcare and education, distribute subsidized food, and support housing projects for low-income communities. For many Venezuelans, these programs represented tangible improvements in daily life, a reclamation of national wealth for the people rather than elites. At the same time, Chavez centralized power in ways that would later generate controversy. The government increasingly controlled the judiciary, the electoral system, and state-owned industries. Independent media faced restrictions. Critics argued that democratic institutions were being weakened, even as supporters celebrated the expansion of citizen participation through local councils and referenda. Venezuela's oil wealth played a central role in these transformations. Chavez used petroleum revenues to fund social programs and consolidate political support. During years of high oil prices, his government was able to expand subsidies, increase public spending, and maintain popularity. Yet this dependence on oil also created vulnerabilities. When prices fell, the economy struggled to maintain the ambitious programs, exposing structural weaknesses in both the state and society. Chavez's foreign policy further reinforced the Bolivarian Revolution's goals. He sought to challenge U.S. influence in Latin America, forge alliances with regional governments sympathetic to his ideology, and promote a vision of Latin American solidarity grounded in independence and resistance to perceived imperialism. He supported leftist movements in governments across the continent, positioning Venezuela as a leader of a new regional order. Despite widespread support, Chavez faced ongoing opposition. Political polarization deepened as opposition parties, business leaders, and segments of the middle class resisted his policies. Protests erupted periodically, sometimes turning violent. The media and civil society became arenas of contestation, reflecting the broader societal divisions created by rapid and sweeping change. Chavez survived several crises, including a 2002 coup attempt, which briefly removed him from office before he was reinstated amid mass demonstrations and military loyalty shifts. This period highlighted both the volatility of Venezuelan politics and the enduring loyalty he commanded among many citizens, particularly those who had benefited directly from his social programs. By the end of his presidency, Chávez had fundamentally reshaped Venezuela. He had expanded access to social services, increased public participation in government, and solidified a national identity closely tied to his vision of Bolivarian ideals. At the same time, his governance style concentrated authority, polarized society, and created an economy heavily dependent on oil revenue. These legacies would profoundly influence the challenges Venezuela faced after his death. Chávez passed away in 2013, leaving a nation both inspired and divided. Supporters hailed him as the defender of the poor and the embodiment of Venezuelan sovereignty. Critics viewed him as the architect of institutional erosion and economic mismanagement. His death marked a turning point, transferring power to his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, and setting the stage for the political, social, and economic crises that followed in the 2010s and 2020s. The Bolivarian Revolution's impact extends beyond Venezuela's borders. It influenced regional politics, inspired leftist movements, and reshaped the discourse around resource management, social justice, and national sovereignty. Its legacy is complex, a mix of social progress, political centralization, and economic vulnerability. For modern Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution is both history and lived reality. Streets, schools, and hospitals bear the imprint of Chávez's policies, just as the economic hardships, political disputes, and international controversies reflect the unresolved challenges of his era. It is a reminder that leadership, wealth, and ideology can shape a nation profoundly, yet no single vision, however bold, can solve the persistent tensions of society, economy, and governance alone. In contemplating Chávez and his revolution, one sees the enduring theme of Venezuelan history: the pursuit of freedom, equality, and sovereignty, always intertwined with struggle, ambition, and human imperfection. Bolivar's ideals lived on in Chávez's rhetoric and policies, demonstrating how the past continues to guide the present. Yet the challenges of balancing power, wealth, and justice remain, as they have for centuries. In quiet moments, in the plazas of Caracas, or along the shores of Lake Maracaibo, the people of Venezuela live with this legacy, a nation shaped by revolutions, by oil, and by leaders who dared to imagine a country defined not only by history but by the enduring hope of its citizens. The start of the 2020s found Venezuela in a position few nations dreamed of, a country with enormous natural wealth, yet beset by deep economic collapse, political division, and widespread humanitarian hardship. The promise of independence and oil-fueled prosperity had, over decades, given way to one of the most serious crises in the Western Hemisphere. A crisis felt in every region of the nation, from the bustling streets of Caracas to rural villages far from the capital. At the heart of this turbulence lay a convergence of economic decline, political strife, and social upheaval forces that shaped daily life for millions of Venezuelans in profound and painful ways. What followed would become a defining chapter not just for Venezuela, but for the region and the world. Economic implosion and social strain. For much of the early 2020s, Venezuela's economy remained in deep contraction. After years of shrinking production, high-paid inflation, and the collapse of key industries, the country's GDP had fallen sharply from its levels in the 2010s. Vast numbers of Venezuelans struggled with scarcity of food, medicine, and fuel, even as the nation's oil reserves remained among the largest on Earth. Oil production, once measured in millions of barrels per day, lingered well below previous peaks. Pipelines and refineries that had offered hope for national prosperity now stood in disrepair, underfunded and underutilized. Blackouts, shortages, and inflation came to mark daily routines, squeezing households already weakened by years of diminished public services. In these years, a mass migration unprecedented in Latin American history continued to unfold. Millions of Venezuelans sought refuge in neighboring countries and beyond, creating diasporas that stretched from Bogota to Santiago, Miami to Madrid. These were not merely numbers, but entire families leaving homes that could no longer sustain. Doctors and teachers seeking work abroad, and young people growing up outside the land of their birth. Political fracture and contested power. Politics during the early 2020s were deeply polarized. President Nicolas Maduro and his government maintained tight control over state institutions, while opposition groups struggled for influence and international recognition. The 2024 presidential election, now widely regarded as deeply flawed, intensified these divisions. Opposition leaders claimed victory based on widespread vote tallies, while government officials declared Maduro the winner amid accusations of fraud and exclusion of key candidates. This contest did not merely play out in ballots. It spilled onto the streets, into homes, into the offices of embassies, and into international forums. Protests erupted, repression followed, and society fragmented along political lines. For many citizens, faith in democratic processes eroded sharply, replaced by fear, anger, and uncertainty about governance and representation. International tensions and the 2026 intervention, the political stalemate in Venezuela, increasingly drew foreign attention and intervention. The United States, having imposed sanctions and pursued legal actions against Maduro for alleged involvement in narco-trafficking and narco-terrorism for years, escalated its stance dramatically at the outset of January 2026. A large-scale military operation, later described by U.S. officials as aiming to dismantle criminal networks, resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores, and their transfer to the United States to face federal charges. For some Venezuelans and observers abroad, the operation was greeted with relief, a sense that a long period of impunity and violence might finally be challenged. For others, it represented a grave violation of national sovereignty and international law. Critics argued that an act of foreign force against a sitting government, however compromised that government, might have been raised profound legal and ethical questions, inviting others to question whether similar interventions might become normalized. International reactions varied sharply. Some governments condemned the intervention as a breach of sovereignty, calling for respect to Venezuelan self-determination and international law. Others defended the operation as a necessary step in addressing criminal networks deeply embedded in state structures. At the United Nations, debates unfolded over legality, regional stability, and the future of multilateral governance in a world increasingly stirred by competing powers, uncertain governance, and shifting authority. Within Venezuela, the immediate aftermath of the intervention was one of political disorder. The Supreme Court designated Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, even as U.S. leaders spoke publicly of managing the transition to a new authority. This duality, a government asserting continuity while a foreign power described plans for overseeing change, created deep ambiguity about who actually exercised authority in the country. In the streets of Caracas and other urban centers, groups loyal to the ousted government, including armed political collectives, engaged in confrontations with citizens perceived to support the intervention. Human rights groups reported clashes, arbitrary detentions, and heightened insecurity in many areas. At the same time, the new administration under Rodriguez's leadership announced the release of multiple political prisoners, including opposition leaders and foreign nationals, as a gesture toward national reconciliation and a possible new chapter of governance. This move sparked cautious optimism among families and activists who had long suffered under years of political imprisonment and repression. Hope amid hardship, even as political conflict and economic hardship continued. Many Venezuelans sought ways to rebuild life from the fragments of crisis. Neighborhood groups organized food distribution when formal systems failed. Small businesses reopened despite instability. Venezuelan artists and poets created work that blended grief with hope, reimagining the identity of a nation forged through centuries of struggle. Families separated by migration continued to maintain connections across borders, sending remittances, sharing stories, and nurturing dreams of return. Religious congregations offered support where governments could not. Grassroots organizations worked to treat dental cavities and childhood illnesses in communities where clinics were scarce or broken. Hope, though fragile, did not vanish. In schools, a new generation of young Venezuelans grappled with questions of civic duty, economic opportunity, and national identity in a world defined by transnational movement and digital connectivity. Many learned history not from textbooks alone, but from the lived experiences of parents and grandparents who endured colonial rule, independence war, oil booms, economic collapse, and political turmoil. These young people, growing up in diaspora or at home, carried voices of both memory and possibility, the path forward. As the decade unfolded, Venezuela stood at another crossroads, uncertain yet unextinguished. The crisis of the early 2020s had strained institutions, fractured society, and challenged the very notion of sovereignty. The intervention of 2026 complicated the nation's relationship with the wider world and raised questions about regional stability and international law. Yet within these complexities lay potential seeds of renewal. Steps toward political inclusion, economic stabilization, and social reconciliation were discussed in living rooms and public forums alike. International organizations called for dialogues that included both government and opposition voices, emphasizing peaceful transitions and respect for human rights. Venezuela's neighbors, from Colombia to Brazil, explored regional cooperation frameworks to address migration, security, and economic recovery. Above all, the people of Venezuela, divided, resilient, continue to live, work, argue, and hope beneath the same sun and skies that had watched centuries of their history unfold. The story of the 2020s is not a simple tale of collapse or triumph. It is, like all profound histories, one of endurance through adversity, debate over identity, and the enduring human capacity to imagine a future beyond today's horizon. And as the Orinoco flows on, weaving between plains and mountains, the nation it carries remains neither defined by its past nor imprisoned by its present, but moving always toward what might yet be. After years of crisis, upheaval, and foreign intervention, Venezuela faced the immense task of rebuilding itself, not just physically, but socially, politically, and economically. The capture of Nicolas Maduro in early 2026 marked a turning point, but it did not automatically restore stability. The nation had been weakened by years of institutional fragility, economic collapse, and social tension. Reconstructing the country required careful planning, unity, and patience, qualities that had often been tested in Venezuela's long history. The immediate challenges were enormous. Essential services, long neglected, had to be restored. Electricity grids needed repairs after decades of underinvestment and recurrent blackouts. Roads, bridges, and public transportation systems had suffered, complicating movement and trade. Hospitals and clinics faced shortages of medicine and trained staff. Schools required both rebuilding and reorganization to accommodate the millions of young Venezuelans who had experienced interrupted education. Yet, amidst these challenges, a sense of resilience emerged. Local communities, who had endured scarcity and insecurity for years, began organizing grassroots efforts to restore everyday life. Neighborhood councils coordinated clean water distribution. Community kitchens provided food to families, and volunteer networks assisted the elderly and infirm. In many ways, Venezuelans rediscovered the power of local initiative, demonstrating that recovery often begins not at the top of government, but in the daily actions of ordinary citizens. Economic rebuilding also required attention. Venezuela's dependence on oil, while a source of wealth for decades, had created vulnerability. Rebuilding the oil sector became a priority, but so did diversifying the economy. Small businesses, agriculture, and local manufacturing received support from both private and public initiatives. International investment returned cautiously, with oversight aimed at ensuring transparency and sustainability. Diaspora Venezuelans contributed as well, sending remittances, investing in local projects, and sharing skills acquired abroad. Political reconstruction was no less complex. The new leadership under Delcy Rodriguez, alongside other interim authorities, had to navigate the delicate task of establishing legitimacy while avoiding further polarization. Measures were introduced to encourage dialogue between former opposition leaders, civic organizations, and international partners. The release of political prisoners and the recognition of opposition voices signaled an early attempt to rebuild trust, a fragile but essential element for long-term governance. Cultural and social renewal was equally significant. Venezuelans began reclaiming public spaces, plazas, parks, and librarias as venues for community engagement and creative expression. Music, poetry, and visual arts flourished once again, serving as both a form of therapy and a reminder of national identity. Schools incorporated lessons about resilience, history, and civic responsibility. fostering a sense of belonging and shared purpose in the next generation. Even in moments of uncertainty, hope began to take root. The people of Caracas, Maracaibo, Barquisimeto, and smaller towns witnessed the return of markets, shops, and public services. Farmers restored fields disrupted by years of neglect or conflict. Local artisans revived traditions that had nearly disappeared. The diaspora sent back stories, supplies, and ideas, connecting Venezuela to the wider world in ways that strengthened both economy and spirit. Venezuela's rebuilding process was also shaped by international partnerships. Neighboring countries provided support for refugees, while global organizations assisted with humanitarian aid, infrastructure, projects, and governance training. International observers worked alongside local authorities to monitor elections, strengthen judicial independence, and advise on economic stabilization. These collaborations, though imperfect, offered frameworks for rebuilding confidence in institutions and governance. Yet the path of recovery was not linear. Structural inequality, corruption, and social divisions remained persistent obstacles. Armed groups and former paramilitaries still exerted influence in certain regions, challenging security and governance. Political debates remained heated, with some citizens demanding immediate reform, while others warned against hasty measures that might destabilize fragile progress. Balancing reform with stability became the central task of Venezuela's emerging leadership. Amid these challenges, a deeper sense of national reflection began to take hold. Citizens and leaders alike contemplated the lessons of Venezuela's tumultuous history, the costs of over-reliance on a single resource, the importance of civic participation, the consequences of political polarization, and the enduring value of resilience. Schools taught history not only as a collection of events, but as a guide to understanding present circumstances and imagining the future. By the late 2020s, the country displayed signs of slow but tangible recovery. Food distribution networks were more reliable, public utilities functioned more consistently, and basic economic activity resumed. People returned to markets, schools reopened fully, and civil society organizations strengthened. Social programs, though scaled down, continued to provide essential services. Venezuelans began to navigate daily life with a renewed sense of possibility, even as caution and vigilance remained necessary. Rebuilding was, at its core, a collective endeavor. Citizens, government, diaspora, and international partners all contributed to the process. Lessons from decades of struggle, from colonial resistance to independence wars, from oil booms to political upheaval informed strategies for renewal. The memory of hardships strengthened resolve, while the experience of survival nurtured empathy, solidarity, and determination. Ultimately, Chapter 17 reminds us that recovery is an ongoing journey, not a single event. Venezuela's infrastructure, economy, and governance could be restored with time, investment, and planning. Its social fabric, frayed by years of crisis, required patience, trust building, and inclusive participation. Most importantly, the people of Venezuela themselves became the heart of renewal, proving that hope, resilience, and collective action are the foundation upon which nations rebuild. In the quiet streets of Caracas at dawn, or along the Orinoco River as the sun rises over the plains, the signs of renewal can be seen. Children attending school, families tending gardens, markets opening once more, and communities coming together in shared purpose. Venezuela, like the river that flows through its lands, continues to move forward, persistent, patient, and full of potential. Rebuilding and renewal are never immediate, never simple, and never complete. They are ongoing processes, marked by small victories, setbacks, and the unending work of citizens committed to creating a life worth living. Venezuela's story, forged over centuries of struggle and resilience, carries into this new chapter a quiet promise that even after profound hardship, renewal is possible and hope endures. In every long story, there comes a moment of reflection when the echoes of the past, the realities of the present, and the possibilities of the future converge in a quiet, thoughtful pause. For Venezuela, that moment arrives at the close of our shared narrative. A nation shaped by centuries of struggle, endurance, transformation, and renewal. What was once a land of indigenous dwellers and colonial conquests, then revolutions and oil empires, now stands in the early decades of the 21st century at a threshold of introspection and possibility. Venezuela's past is vast, and its legacy deep. Its landscape remembers the campaigns of independence led by both the rise and fall of republics, the wealth of oil, and the turbulence of political revolutions. Yet all of these events, no matter how monumental, led to a single and enduring truth. A nation is more than geography or resources. It is the sum of its people, as hopes, choices, and resilience. In the present century, Venezuela has endured one of the most prolonged and complex crises in its history. Economic contraction, hyperinflation, political polarization, and social dislocation have become familiar terms in daily life, not simply for analysts studying distant capitals, but for families struggling to provide food, medicine, and stability. According to surveys from recent years, a majority of Venezuelans reported difficulty affording basic food, and public trust in institutions ached under years of hardship and political dispute. The roots of these challenges were not abrupt. They emerged from decades of reliance on a single resource, oil, and cycles of boom and bust that transformed once fertile agricultural land into pipelines and refineries. At times, oil wealth lifted living standards and funded ambitious social programs. At others, it deepened dependency, obscured structural weaknesses, and magnified inequalities. The very abundance that once promised prosperity became, in periods of volatility, a source of vulnerability. But as the nation looks forward, the crises of recent years are not the end of Venezuela's story. They are the impetus for a new beginning. In the aftermath of political upheaval in early 2026, when former President Nicolas Maduro was captured during an unprecedented intervention that drew global controversy, the country entered a period of uncertainty that might in time open space for renewal and reform. This transition has been neither smooth nor assured. Interim governance, under figures like Delcy Rodriguez, backed by elements of the existing political structure, faces deep skepticism and resistance from many citizens. Armed militias and collectives still influence public spaces in some areas, creating tension and instability. Yet in quiet gestures and tentative reforms, new possibilities emerge. In early 2026, the release of political detainees by the interim government was widely reported and received with cautious optimism as an attempt to ease divisions and begin reconciliation. Hope in Venezuela does not arrive suddenly, nor as a single policy or speech. It grows slowly, like a river cutting through rock over centuries, through community rebuilding, dialogue across political divides, and incremental improvements in daily life. For many Venezuelans, rebuilding means restoring schools and hospitals, supporting local agriculture and small business, and creating space for dialogue where silence once reigned. Economically, the path forward is neither linear nor guaranteed. Estimates of growth vary widely. Some projections suggest real expansion in recent years, while institutional analyses still emphasize persistent macroeconomic fragility and deep structural challenges, like currency depreciation and limited access to credit. The oil sector, an enduring backbone of the economy, remains central. Its revival, even partially, could reshape global energy markets and provide vital revenue. But it requires major investment, infrastructure, repair, and stable governance. Analysts have pointed out that increased production could influence global oil prices and attract international interest, but the scale of renewal needed is immense. Beyond economics, Venezuela's future is tied to how its society reconciles a complex past with a shared vision of tomorrow. Migration has left deep imprints in families and communities, forging diasporas that carry Venezuelan culture across the world. These global connections may become assets as the nation seeks to rejoin international markets, rebuild institutions, and integrate into broader regional and global frameworks. Political life, too, must evolve. The lack of trust in elections and political processes, evident in multiple disputed electoral cycles in the past decade, highlights the need for genuine, inclusive systems that reflect citizens' aspirations rather than polarization. Yet the very debate over competing visions of governance, whether more centralized or more decentralized, more state-driven or more market-oriented, reflects a vibrant, if contested, civic energy. Drawing on lessons from independence movements, the Bolivarian era, and recent struggles, Venezuelans increasingly engage in dialogue about accountability, social justice, and inclusive growth. These conversations may be slow and uneven, but they are the substance of democratic renewal. The environment too presents opportunities and responsibilities. Venezuela's natural beauty, from the Orinoco River to the Caribbean coast, from the Andes' cool heights to the Amazonas, lush canopy reminds its people that their nation has future is not just political or economic, but ecological as well. Sustainable development, reforestation, conservation, and climate resilience could shape a new chapter that harmonizes human progress with environmental stewardship. As Venezuela reflects on its history, one lesson resonates with particular clarity. Identity is not static. It evolves, shaped by shared experiences, deep memory, and collective aspiration. From the indigenous communities who first walked these lands, through colonial resistance and independence wars, to the oil era and modern upheavals, Venezuelans have learned that challenges are not ends in themselves, but crossroads leading to transformation. When dusk settles over Caracas and the light softens over the distant plains, or when dawn breaks over the tranquil waters of Lake Maracaibo, life quietly continues. Children laugh on sidewalks, families gather around meals, music drifts from open windows, and the rhythms of daily living persist alongside global uncertainty. In this continuity, there lies a profound hope that the future of Venezuela is not preordained, but to be written day by day by the people who call it home. The story of this nation, its triumphs and trials, carries forward in every heart that hopes for a just society, every community that works for shared prosperity, and every young mind that imagines a tomorrow not defined by crisis but by possibility. Venezuela's legacy is not solely in its past, nor its present difficulty. It is in the enduring belief that, no matter the trials endured, a new chapter can always begin, shaped by resilience, conversation, compassion, and the quiet strength of a people determined to continue writing their nation's story. And so, as our journey through Venezuela's long history comes to rest, we leave this land as we found it, shaped by time, tested by struggle, and carried forward by the quiet strength of its people. From ancient rivers and open plains, to cities rising and falling, from moments of triumph to seasons of hardship, Venezuela's story reminds us that history is never still. It flows, like the Orinoco, patient, persistent, and always moving forward. As the past settles into memory, may its lessons soften into understanding, and its stories fade gently into the night. Thank you for listening. May you rest peacefully, and may tomorrow begin with calm and quiet hope. Good night.